So one of the problems that we have in our culture is that many of the debates around poverty are guided by very strong myths. And our textbook outlines 5 major myths of poverty. And what I want to do is go through those myths. So let's start out. This is page 187 in the 12th edition of the textbook. Let's start out with the first myth on here. The first myth states that people are poor because they are too lazy to work. And I'm going to draw some graphs to demonstrate why this is a problematic idea. First of all, half of the people who are poor are not of working age. They are elderly or they are children. We have a big problem with child poverty in this country. So by the time you add elderly people who can't work together with children, that's about half of the poor, which leaves the other half who are of working age. And they aren't necessarily lazy. Many of them have jobs. They could be the working poor. Their job might not be enough to get them out of poverty. It might be a part-time job. It might be a job that's full-time but doesn't pay a good salary. And so we cannot assume that most poor people are just sitting around and not trying to work. That is a common myth that people have of poverty. The second myth, and your book actually is a little bit off on this myth, so I want to talk about it in a little more depth, is that most people of color are poor and most of the poor are people of color. And those are 2 different myths, and one of them is no longer accurate. So it is true that if we look at every major racial group, there is not one group where more than half of the people are in poverty. I'm going to blow up this chart so that you can read it more thoroughly. So if you look, roughly 31% of Native Americans, 28% of African Americans, 27% of Latinos, and 12% of Asian Americans and 13% of white Americans are poor. There's no group where more than half of the people are in poverty. So if you study the chart, there's no group where more than half of the people are in poverty. So it would not be fair to say that most African Americans are poor. It would not be fair to say that most Asians or Latinos are poor. The next myth is the one where your textbook is a little bit off. So this book was published in 2012. This is the 11th edition. If you get the 12th edition, this should be updated. At that point in time, the biggest group of poor people was poor white people. Poor white people made up over half of the population. That has since changed, and more recently, whites are about 44% of the poor. And if you look at this graph that I'm showing you right here, what you're going to see is that while whites make up the plurality of people in poverty, by the time you add all people of color together, blacks plus Asians plus Latinos plus Native Americans, then you have more people of color in poverty than white people. But again, whites make up the largest group. And we think about that stereotype. Where would that get perpetuated? Probably in media, probably from politicians. You would see those stereotypes. There are a lot of poor white people. They're the largest group. They're no longer half, but they're just below half. And we want to think about places like rural Appalachia or a lot of rural communities in this country, in the South, for example, where there are quite a few people who are white who are living in poverty. So just to put those 2 things together, while more than half of people of color are not poor, I do want to note that the poverty rates are higher. So for every 100 people, poverty rates for African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos are higher than whites. The Asian number is a bit deceptive. It looks, when you look at the chart, looks like Asians are a lower number. That's deceptive in part because Asians tend to live in very, very expensive places like California, Hawaii, New York, Seattle. These communities that have large Asian American populations are extremely expensive. And so you could be making $35,000 there, and while that might put you outside of the realm of poverty, that is not a living wage in that kind of environment. All right, the third myth. The third myth says that most of the poor are single mothers with children. Single mothers with children do make up a lot of the poor. But by the time you add married couples, people who live alone, people who live with roommates, and single fathers together, those groups are well over half of the poor. The most recent data I have indicates that about 35% of the poor are married couples, 38% of the poor are single moms. 22% are people who are living alone or with a non-relative. They might be young people just starting out. They might be widows. They might have a group of roommates living in a house. So we can't forget about that population, and we also can't forget about the single fathers. So single moms make up a lot of the poor. They just don't make up the bulk of the poor. All right, the next myth. The next myth is that most people in poverty live in the inner city. The truth is that suburban poverty is growing. There are now more poor people in the suburbs than there are in the cities. The poverty rates in the suburbs are still lower, but if you look at the overall number, if we're just counting where people are and where they live, there are more poor people in suburbs. And by far the poorest places in the U.S., there are some poor inner city areas that are chronically experiencing poverty, and there are a lot of rural areas who have very entrenched poverty, and often we overlook rural poverty in the discussion. So it would be a myth to think of poverty as something that's an inner city problem. The suburbs, again, are experiencing growing poverty, and rural areas have a very long history of having high poverty rates. The last myth says that most of the poor, or most of the budget, most of our welfare budget goes towards people who are poor, and that these anti-poverty programs are putting a strain on our federal budget. The two biggest social welfare programs that are in our budget are Social Security and Medicare. And Social Security and Medicare are not means-tested programs. What that means is they are not programs that only go to poor people. Middle-class people can get Medicare. Your primary requirement to get Medicare or Social Security is that you are of retirement age, right? So you need to be 65 or older. You can get it a little earlier or defer it till a little later in some cases as well. But most people who are getting these are getting them because they're old, not necessarily because they are poor. And also we should think about the defense budget. How much money do we spend on things like defense as opposed to food stamps or public welfare programs? And when you add all of that up, that's not really a big part of our budget. We are spending a lot more money on other things, in particular these programs like Social Security and Medicare, and things like our defense and national security budget. And I'm not passing judgment about whether that's right or wrong. You can make your own decision about that, but it would be a myth to say that most of the people who are poor are straining the budget with these programs that they're getting. A couple other points about poverty. Poverty is dispersed very differently across the United States. So if we were to look at a map, I'm going to get this map up here right now, of the U.S., what we would notice is that poverty is different in different areas. And so here we have a chart. The green areas represent high poverty rates. The yellow ones are kind of moderate poverty, and the lowest ones are the purple ones, which have less poverty. And what you should notice is that the South and the Southeast have higher poverty. There's kind of a middle belt running through the country. And there are a group of states on the East Coast and in the Northeast and in the upper Midwest that have lower poverty. What you may not know by looking at this is that poverty is very heavily influenced by the racial makeup of these states as well. While most people of color are not poor, they do have higher poverty rates. And when you look at this map, you'll see states like Texas or Louisiana, North Carolina, New Mexico, states that have very large, Mississippi, very large populations of African Americans and Latinos, also tend to have high poverty rates. So there is a relationship there between poverty and race. It should be duly noted that Maryland is one of the lowest poverty states in the United States. It is second from the bottom. This data is all from 2014. Some of this could change, and we might see huge changes with this looming recession and possibly depression created by this global health crisis that we're in here in 2020. There's also variation according to age. And so that's another thing I want to bring up. There is a chart in the 12th edition of your textbook, or no, I'm sorry, the 11th edition of your textbook, that looks at poverty, and it breaks it down by age. And this is on page 190. So here we have poverty by age. If you look at this chart carefully, what you will see is that in the 1960s, there were more poor people who were older people, people over 65, and there were fewer people in poverty who were under 18. But what has happened in the United States is we have shifted. And what we are now seeing is that the poverty rate is actually higher for children than it is for elderly people. And some may ask, what happened? Why is the child poverty rate so high? In 2010, about 22% of the people in poverty were children. You go a couple years later, this other book I have here looks at 2014. In 2014, 22%, well, that's about the same, 22% of children were in poverty compared to 9% of the elderly. So what we are seeing is this trend towards children becoming poorer and poorer. And on 191, there is a graph that looks at other wealthy countries in the world, places like France, Canada, Sweden, the UK. And what we see is that the United States has one of the highest poverty rates. Again, that data is from 2005 on that chart. Our poverty rate's even higher now. So we're unfortunately number one. So what's happened? Why, when it comes to other wealthy countries, again, we're not talking about poor countries, why is our poverty so high? You know, and the reason our poverty is so high is because we have de-invested in programs that help poor children. Programs like we used to have one called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. It's now called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. We have cut back on those programs. We've made more bureaucratic loopholes to get things like food stamps, or WIC, which is a supplemental nutritional program for poor families with children. We are not investing as much money in children. Children have become very, very expensive. So when people have children, they are not able to work, for example, because they can't afford the child care. So we have seen this ongoing trend. It's a rather disturbing trend because if you start out in poverty, you're more likely to get a lower quality education, you're more likely to have health problems, and you're more likely to be poor when you're older. And so these are all things that we have to consider as we talk about trends in poverty. And I'll leave you in the last 20 or 30 seconds here with one other chart as we transition towards talking about race. This chart looks at race and your likelihood of being in poverty by your race and your level of education. And if you look at this chart closely, you will see that people with less education of all races are more likely to be in poverty. And the more education you get, the less likely you are to be in poverty. But you should also note that white people who have dropped out of high school actually have lower rates of poverty than black people who have dropped out of college. So white high school dropouts, they, according to this chart, have about 17% rate in poverty. A comparable number for African Americans who have dropped out of college is 19%. So being white has a huge advantage when it comes to keeping you out of poverty. Even if you have more education, you'll see that the poverty rate is only 5% for whites, and it's all the way up to 8%, which is not a huge difference for all of the other groups. So being white really helps move you out of poverty. And on that note, you should get ready for the next group of videos that are going to talk about race.